Well, hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today we are going to be diving deep into something that could change the way we manage human capital. Joining me on this journey is my dear friend, Scott Morris. Scott is a seasoned CHRO. He's got the scar tissue to prove it, and he's also a founder and tech genius with his company, Propulsion AI. If you don't know what that is, go check it out. It can save you a ton of time and effort. So, Scott, we've had some interesting back and forth over the last few weeks that we've been doing this together. And I wanted to throw out my provocative take because up to this point, like, you get all the fun. Here it is.
Let's hear it.
What if we focused all of our talent discussions on 2 to 5% of the jobs where they are pivotal, where having someone great versus good could make the biggest difference to the organization. And from a people standpoint, we only cared about getting A players into those pivotal roles. Why do you do that?
Well, hold on. Before you go further, define pivotal, because I could drive a truck through that term.
I love it when you say that about my ideas. So I go all the way back to John Boudreau, who's at the Center for Effective Organizations. He's written tons of books, Talentology being one of the best ones. And he's the one that ultimately came up with the concept of pivotal role. And in his example, he talks about roles where having someone great versus good will make the biggest difference to driving what the organization is trying to achieve. He also talks a little bit about where having a change in the marketplace, so a supplier demand shock for talent for those roles, would make a materially high impact on your business. And in his storyline, he uses Disney because he's down in Southern California. He spends a lot of time with that. And he says, and I love it when he tells the story, I won't do it justice, but he tells the story about what's the most pivotal role at Disneyland. And it's not Mickey Mouse, because the difference between a good Mickey and a bad Mickey is really, really low. Now, if you have a horrible Mickey, totally different story, but that tends to resolve itself before they get into public. But the pivotal role isn't who plays any of the characters. It's the street sweeper. And why is that? It's because the street sweeper is the one that is the first point of contact with all of the guests. The street sweeper is the person who figures out, there's a parade coming. Let me get the family where they need to be in the shade. The street sweeper is there that makes sure that everything looks clean and tidy, which in the mental view means safe. The street sweeper is the person, when the kid is going apoplectic, figures a way to pull them away from the balance of the guests so that one kid doesn't ruin everybody's experience. And so if you were to look at what Disney does for the street sweeper, they spend a disproportionate amount of their time, energy, and effort towards making sure that job is right. They have disproportionate investment in their selection tools, disproportionate investment in their compensation, disproportionate investment in their performance management, and disproportionate investment in their training. So I'm wondering why more companies don't find roles like that in their organization and overly invest their time and effort into those roles like Disney does with the street sweeper. That's what I mean by pivotal roles.
I think that's a great definition. I love that story. You do it justice. And I do think the street sweeper is important, but it calls to mind for me another question, which is who gets to decide that the role is pivotal? Because you and I both like that story. We both see that the same way. But I bet that there is somebody over in marketing that says, hey, you know what? That's all and good. But if this person on my team didn't do this, nobody be in that park to begin with.
I'm going to move us away from the Disney example for a minute. And what I want to talk about is what it is that a HR person needs to have more than anything else to be successful. I would argue it's not technical skill. I would argue it is business acumen and the ability to influence. That is certainly true in kind of HR business partner or problem solver or whatever lingo we want to ultimately transition the function to. If you know how the business works, you have the ability to ask the right questions and lead people into the right direction. It is very clear the first time anyone goes through this exercise, they will necessarily figure out more senior players versus more junior players. But through a series of questions, and I've done this 36 times, it doesn't take long to get to the point where you realize, it's not the head of marketing, it's the product manager role. It's not the chief operating officer, it's the frontline management. And as you think through, because you know how the business operates, and you're able to ask questions effectively and influence in the direction that you're headed, you don't even need to know where you're heading, other than you should know that if the answer comes back, it's all the senior players, you probably have more work to be done.
How do
I don't
you
know.
how do you keep, because you have done this a lot, and I know you've done it successfully because we've talked through some of the examples of where you've done it, but how do you keep everybody's head in the same space? Because there's a difference between pivotal role and an important role. And I've got my own definition of that. I know you do too, but like how do you make that clear to people so that they are rowing the boat in the same direction when it comes to defining these things?
If a job doesn't provide value above what it costs, then it's not an important role. If it is, then you've already passed that threshold. Now it's a matter of degree. For these roles, it's a matter of what is the business strategy? And you look at it through a talent lens and you say, what needs to be true for that to happen? And we talked the street sweeper. I played in the manufacturing space for a long period of time. What do you need for the manufacturing plan to work? Well, you need organized teams that are very focused on managing the fundamentals day in and day out. I worked in the Frito-Lay organization. We had entire infrastructure built around how do you drive engaged business teams. And when you do that, what becomes very clear is there is a role that can influence the most number of people towards that end, and it's the frontline supervisor. And so the manufacturing manager, pretty important. The tech manager, really, really important. The difference between having a good and bad tech manager, really, really limited. However, having a good frontline manager on third shift versus a medium frontline manager on third shift versus a crappy one on third shift, you see that in your results day in and day out. And so if you can lead with questions towards that end, it doesn't take much to get folks off of I need to have a good manufacturing manager in place. That's true. But having a great one versus a good one is not as impactful as having an entire set of exceptional frontline managers versus average frontline managers.
So here's, as I'm listening to you, here's some things I'm synthesizing out. Check me to see if it's consistent with what you're saying. So it's really about the role. It's not about the person. And it's about the outsized impact that the role has on the business strategy versus simply being an important part of the chain of events that have to happen to make the business run. Did I hear it right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It has nothing to do with the individual. It has to do with the role. Well, the individual play comes in shortly. But the part that you missed in it, and it's my fault because I didn't really talk through it, is the second part of a pivotal role is kind of where it is in the marketplace. So again, I go all the way back to Frito-Lay as to form my foundation of this concept. We had over the road drivers that made sure that we had the arteries clear to get fun food within arm's reach of every human being in the United States. So was that truck driver good versus medium versus bad, that kind of highly leveraged? Probably not. Like, we wanted safe drivers versus unsafe drivers, sure. But you get the unsafe drivers out. The difference between a good and a great, not that big. However, there aren't enough truck drivers, and there haven't been for about the last 30 years, which is why you see the supply and demand and what you pay is materially different. So Frito-Lay back 30 years ago made the decision to do two things. One, to go as union free as they could in that work group so that the arteries would always be flowing. So that was an application of labor strategy related to the pivotal role. And the second thing they did is they wanted to be paying at the top of the market because they wanted the best paying. They wanted to have no third party that could add any undue influence. And if someone came in and, largest, at least at the time, Walmart had the biggest kind of non-governmental fleet, if they were to make a material change in their cost and what they pay people, you can have a material impact on your access to that talent. And so if you're in the middle, which is again why they wanted to be paying near the top of the scale, if not setting the market in many places that they were in. And so it is not only where you have someone great versus good can make the biggest difference, but it is also where an exogenous change, a material change in the supply of labor in the market would have an impact on your ability to get the job. Those are the roles, and they're like somewhere between 2 and 10%, where really focusing your effort on those can make a huge impact.
So once we've defined a role as pivotal, and now we've got a definition of it that should be easier, what do we do with it?
So if you go back almost a month now, and we had Chris Merceau from Top Grading on here, he talked about the concept of having an A player. So the answer is you get A players in those most critical roles.
Ooh, this sounds dangerous, and I love it. What is an A player?
Well, as we talked about it, someone in the top quartile of what you're willing to pay for the role. So it is someone who has the ability to make other people around them great. It is someone who has the ability to deliver the outcomes necessary for the role to be seen as successful. And it's somebody who ultimately is consistent in delivering the results that you expect from the role.
So are the criteria any different than we would use in a standard 9 box where we're plotting potential against actual performance? Is it different than that?
Don't get me started on 9 boxes. I think those are the biggest waste of time in the history of human capital.
But yet they are widely used, and we're looking at two things that you mentioned, which is people's actual performance. Well, one of them that you mentioned, which is their actual performance. But what about their potential?
I didn't talk potential.
Well, what about it?
So yes, just because something is ubiquitous does not mean that it should be. I'll just we'll have another podcast on.
We're gonna have to do an entire
a
hour
4 box is better
right.
than a 9 box because everyone argues between stuff that doesn't matter. But I digress. What was your question again?
Yeah.
You got me on my hot button.
I told you, dangerous subject. So what, like the definition of a player, right? Is it just about their performance? Is that it?
Yeah, you certainly, I think the answer to that is yes. What you want to do is identify the 3 to 5 things that if the person did these things and only these things at a player rate, top 25% for what you're willing to pay for the role, figure out what those 5 things are and you're good. Now, some people, as I've written about this on LinkedIn, will say, well, what about developing their people? That could be one of the top 5. It's not just the direct performance outcome as measurable in numbers, but it is an outcome around team development and team readiness. And there are a lot of different things that can go into the outcomes. They just have to be outcomes, not activities. But if you define it broadly, if someone can do great 2 jobs from now, then they should not be in the role where I need them to be great today. That's my take.
I followed that. If somebody can be great 2 jobs from now, you don't need them in the current role?
Correct, because I need someone great that's in this job today.
Well, see, I heard something different out of that, and you tell me whether you think this is aligned with the concept. But if you've got a person in the role, you've defined them as an A player, you've defined the role as a pivotal role, and that person has a ton of potential, and you know that at some point they're going to move. I think there's another factor here that we've got to consider for all pivotal roles, which is you better have people lined up that you can put in that role if it's pivotal, and they better be A players or have the potential to become them.
What is really important is to focus in on having an A player in the role where I need them to be an A player today. Your point is well made. And that is, if they are good in that role, they have the potential to potentially be good in other roles. So you need to have a good bench plan underneath that. I would say you need an ascension plan who is ready to ascend behind someone into that role. That is all 100% true. What I'm trying to point to here, though, is if you have an individual who is not an A player today, but you think can get you to be an A player in that role someday with development, I think Probably need to move them into a role so they develop what they need to be an A player and then come back if it's a pivotal role.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, like I think for me, this really captures why defining a role as pivotal is so critically important, and knowing ahead of time these are the roles that we've defined as critical, because there are a lot of moving levers. Who isn't ready but could be, right? And what's that channel of talent? The whole entire point though is that role is going to have an outsized impact on the business strategy. And so all of the inputs have to be right in that role. And there's only one way to do that, and that is to be thinking about it ahead of time. You can't be caught reacting to it. I think for me, that crystallizes why defining pivotal roles in A players is so important. But I've got another question for you, which is when we start naming people as A players, and you and I both know where HR's head goes, right? It becomes inherently unfair to some people, and we have a problem, right? Because now we're creating some kind of perceived caste system. So give me your 2 cents on that.
Man, you're just baiting me into
Well, you said you had a controversial take.
I do. Okay. Well, I didn't want to be this controversial. Look, I think our job is to actually identify top talent and treat them differently. I think if you find a pivotal role, you should overinvest in your hiring strategy. You should overinvest in your selection strategy. You should overinvest in your training strategy. And you should overinvest in your compensation and development strategy against those roles. I think the same thing holds true largely for top talent. And ideally, you have your top talent in your most critical business roles. That's not universally true. I may have an A player in a chief accounting officer role. I'm probably not going to have that person moving into larger organizations. So all your accountants don't get mad at me, but just bear with me on this. That person may be career leveled, but as an A player, I will still want to overly develop them to keep them an A player, no doubt. But if I have $10 and I have 10 people, I probably want to spend most of it on 2 people, not $1 for everybody. And if that is seen as unfair, then I think maybe you need to go work for the government.
I don't disagree with you. I would add a friendly amendment, which I think the way we make it fair to the organization is by being really clear about the criteria that we use to define somebody as an A player, because that makes it accessible to everybody else who wants to be defined that way if we're out in front with the criteria. And then after that, it's a meritocracy.
So do you tell an A player that they're an A player? And equally important, do you tell a B player that they're not?
Well, I mean, I think I would spin it a little bit, but I think yes, net, I think the answer to the question is yes. And to the A player, you want them to know that they're an A player. You want them to know that we're investing in them because you want to keep your A players in the organization. And that level of appreciation and understanding and investment has been shown to keep people in the company. But with the B player, I think it's not we say you're not an A player. We say, hey, we'd like to help you become an A player. And let me be honest with you about some things that you could change in your own performance that are inside of your control. And so that's a path toward becoming defined in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. You could have a B player in the wrong job that becomes an A player immediately
100%.
in the right one. Right. And so redeployment matters a lot here. If there's anything I've run into over my career that I wish I would do less of, is I try to reallocate way more than I try to manage out, because I think it's up to me as a leader to find a way to put people in a position where they can thrive. And I probably allow people to flounder just a little bit longer.
You know, it raises an important point though, because there are some people that we would look at and they are in their roles and we would look at them and say, that is an A player. And then we have a pivotal role over here and we say, we're going to take this person, we're going to put them into this really important role. And then they struggle. Yeah. And so it's a mismatch of a different kind than we were talking about a second ago. What do you do with that?
So handful of things. What most people do is they let them continue to flounder. I think so. Step one is you got to act. If you have invested in someone and they have the ability to get there and they just are struggling kind of out of the gate, then I think doubling down on the investment to rapidly put that person into a player category is important. So the question is, how long do you allow someone to be in that? And that's a part of your talent philosophy that you figure out in any company, depending on where you are and what you're trying to accomplish. That can be That could be 3 months. That could be 2 years. I tend to err on the shorter side, but that's for me. What do you do in a situation, however, where it's just a misfit and you made a bad hire in a bad situation? I think you got to move them back. And the example that I think of every time that comes across is I take my best salesperson and I move them into a sales management job. And then I'll be damned. The things that made them a great individual contributor, when they get other people involved, doesn't scale. I don't know. What would you do?
Well, I would do largely the same thing. I would try, and just for the audience sake, I'll mention one thing that you didn't, and that is I think like the definition of a pivotal role and having a common framework becomes important.
Yeah.
One, so that we're all pulling on the rope in the same direction, and two, so that people have a common and shared understanding. Definitions matter. And I think really defining the kind of person that's going to thrive in the role or that's going to be able to deliver value in the role, I think matters. And the tighter our definition, so we've defined the role as pivotal, which is its impact on business strategy. We equally need to spend time defining what is going to create success. How is value going to get delivered, and what are the approaches that are going to needed or be needed to deliver value in that role? Because then that lets us look at our A players and other people that aren't and make definite or make comparisons about, yeah, that person really is, they are a really top performer, but they are not going to be a top performer in this role. And it might save us a little bit of the back and forth. I do the same thing you do, right? I want to give people the chance. I'm probably too slow to pull them, like you just said that you were. But the definitions up front make it easier for us to judge right and have fewer of those.
Yeah. So this is the part of the podcast where I say something catchy like, "Hey, it's the summary." And that makes sure that anyone who's been nodding off or multitasking comes back and is able to pay attention to the end. We started this conversation with the outrageous take that we should focus all of our effort on like 2 to 10% of the roles. And those are the ones where the roles are pivotal and you need to make sure you have your A players in. So, Scott, I guess I'd ask you, pragmatically speaking, how do you do that? What would you suggest to CHROs out there are kind of a step 1, 2, 3 to get them going down the path?
Yeah, you save the tough questions for me, right? You and I get to philosophize, and then I get a zinger. Well, I mean, I think the first thing that you got to do is you got to start acting, because it's always easier to do something when you have a good working example, right? And so, I'd find a small scale example where you can be successful and start to align the things and the things that we've talked about so far to try and do a summary: compensation, your talent pipeline, your talent philosophy, right? Bring all those things to bear. I think second thing is the more colleagues you can bring along with you, the better off you are. So start with definitions because it gives everybody an anchor, and go out and try and build coalitions of people who are seeing the world in similar terms. And I don't mean the same terms, because I do think a good part of this, at least when I've done it, has been arguing about which roles are pivotal. And that in and of itself reveals a lot about people's understanding of
Right.
business strategy, right? But it's a good debate and it's a meaningful debate. So I think just act, right? Like just go do something and build an example that you can build on. Share the definitions and make sure everybody's on the same page, and build as much coalition along the way as you can, because you need to keep them with them. Those would be my 3 points on this summary.
Yeah, and let me just underscore in pen the notion to start small. You may find yourself in a situation where you have broad disagreement on the top 10% of the roles. I bet you can find a couple of them where there's broad agreement. Start there. That's okay. And then build around it. What's the right hiring strategy? What is the right recruiting strategy? What is the right onboarding and spin up strategy? What is the right compensation strategy? What is the right development strategy? And then create those kind of agile approaches to very specific roles. And what you'll find, I think, is you get buy-in pretty quickly if you pick the right roles up front. And then you'll be in a really fun spot, which is other people will see that and they want to do it with their roles, and they may not have the right roles to be driving for that too. So I think it's exactly right, Scott. I think it's super pragmatic and helpful, which is what we try to do here. So let me take this moment then to wrap this up. And I think I speak for Scott to say that we're really genuinely happy that you joined us today. And we hope that you found value. And if you did, please share it with others who might also benefit from it. And don't forget to like and subscribe. That's the algorithm. It's how it works. We get more listeners and now viewers. And if you want to explore more deeply on these subjects, head on over to my Substack. That's at talentsherpa.substack.com. That's where we dive deeper into the future of work. You can also sign up and find more content for our CHRO readiness cohort at mytalentsherpa.com. It's a new website. It's building as we speak. So hopefully by the time this launches, we'll be ready for prime time. And thank you for listening to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital works. So until next time, keep experimenting, keep delivering, and keep on climbing.